Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum, featuring timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm your host, Tavia Gilbert. Last week, we brought you ISF CEO Steve Durbin speaking about the emerging threats for 2022. And this week, we're back with the presentation's Q&A, in which Steve responds to listener questions.
This is the bit that I always enjoy the most in these sessions, where I get to take questions. The first one here is picking up, I think, on some of the things we were talking about in that sort of people area around remote workers. So let's go with this one to start. So question coming in from Germany. Does being a remote worker have a psychological impact that makes people more likely to click in the wrong place or respond when they shouldn't? It's a really interesting question because, of course, that's one of the challenges, isn't it, that we've all been facing through this working from home, working remote period of time. What have we seen at the ISF? Well, we've seen that actually, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to matter how many awareness programs you put out there, how much effort you put into actually educating the workforce. The key thing that seems to indicate whether or not people are going to click on the wrong links is their degree of fatigue, their degree of tiredness. At the end of a day, they see something coming in that they're being asked to respond to fairly quickly, and they'll click on it. Is that more likely to happen at home rather than in an office environment? Probably, because you don't have that social interaction that's going on all around you. So you are working on your own in the main. Some people are a little bit more fortunate, they've been able to cluster up. But in the main, we're talking about people who are working remotely and on their own. So I think that it's about tiredness, it's about cyber fatigue. So again, what can you do about it? Well, I think it is about recognizing that that's an issue. It's about providing advice and guidance to people that we have working remotely to take breaks, to just, think things through. You don't always have to respond immediately to something that comes through on the screen. Take a breath, think about it. And if you're unsure about anything, then refer it to your IT people or whatever your process is that's running across the organization. So there's no harm in just taking some time out before immediately responding. But there's no doubt that mental health, cyber fatigue is a key issue for remote workers. Next one here, which really, I think, plays on one of the threats that I was talking about, and I alluded to it when we were talking about threat number 2, when we were talking about edge computing. And this one's coming from the UK. So it says, we're hearing a lot about zero trust, but I'm still unclear on how this relates to restricting breach attempts. Can you add some clarity around what zero trust is, and is it easy to adopt the zero trust security model? Wow, that's quite a tricky one, isn't it? So zero trust, lots being talked about. Some of you ISF members perhaps will have read Paul Holland's really interesting briefing paper trying to demystify some of the areas around zero trust, and I've written some things as well myself that have appeared on the Forbes site and in Dark Reading, where we're really trying to sort of unpick the mystique around zero trust. So what is it? Zero trust is not about not trusting people. Zero trust is not about plugging in a piece of software that's going to provide, a catch-all remedy. Zero trust is about understanding the overall corporate real estate across which you're sharing and moving data. And it's about ensuring that those critical assets are protected, irrespective of where they might be across that infrastructure. That, obviously, will need to have you looking again at things like your governance processes, your risk assessment, your risk planning. It will inevitably mean that you take another look at identity and access management to see who's accessing information and so on. It will mean that perhaps you step up some of the monitoring that's going on. So there's a whole range of different things in there that may require you to re-architect your environment from the security standpoint. That's zero trust. It isn't a quick fix. It is about changing the mindset as to how we adapt to really take into account the increased threat that is out there from cyber criminals and people who really want to exfiltrate, steal our data and do things with it that we'd rather they didn't. So for me, it starts with a rework on the strategy. It does need to look at the way in which we've designed our systems. There is a huge amount of security architecture that you need to examine as you go through that. And then finally, it's about transforming the organization, and that will inevitably mean people. It will inevitably mean the way in which you ensure the integrity of data. And so, just thinking about some of the words that I'm using here, a lot of it is traditional security, but we're doing it in an environment where our infrastructure is very much more open. We're using very many more third-party providers. We may have gone down a road of edge computing where we're processing at the point of use as opposed to centrally. We're probably using cloud providers, whether that be private or public. And we're trying to bring a degree of order to an environment that's become increasingly more muddled as things have gone on. Now, the second part of the question there was, how does that relate to restricting breach attempts? It's about visibility. It's about control. It's about making sure that you understand what is happening across that overall network as it relates to your critical assets. So one thing I would finally say on this is don't try and zero trust your organization in one fell swoop. You need to start by looking at the critical assets that you've got. From our perspective, from an ISF standpoint, that will take you down the road of looking at protecting the crown jewels, which we've been talking about for a very long while. Those of you who are members will know that Mark Chaplin has been a very strong advocate of that, and he's been further developing that work in line with his interests in risk management in general. So if you are interested in exploring zero trust in a bit more detail, reach out either to Paul Holland, who's written quite a bit of stuff on this, or indeed to Mark Chaplin, who would be more than happy to have a sensible conversation with you about what that might mean across your organization. All right, what else have we got coming in? Oh, one on regulation, okay? And this one is coming from the United States. So this one says that many nations are imposing regulations that impact the technologies organizations use. Is it going to get more difficult to run a seamless security plan for organizations who operate globally? Well, the short answer is yes. We are seeing a change in the way that regulation is being implemented. And I alluded to this a little bit when I was talking about digital division. We are beginning to see that perhaps the original approach that some organizations had, not all, but some had, of establishing one common security bar, if you like, across the world for all of their subsidiaries and operating units probably isn't going to be the way that they can run security going forward, because we're going to have to take into account very much more local conditions. So we are going to have to take into account what the regulations are in individual countries. We're seeing some fragmentation as well in terms of the way that regulations are being established. So I think from a security standpoint, that makes life a bit more difficult. We've got to focus in very much more on understanding the implications of what's going on in the local countries. Back to my point about digital division, we also need to take into account the skill sets that exist. And here, we aren't just going to need to talk about our own organizations. We need to take into account supply chain. We need to take into account third parties that we interact with, because all of those are relevant in terms of us being comfortable that our security plan isn't just effective, but meets the risk requirements of the organization, that we can monitor it effectively, and in the event of there being some challenges or issues, that we can respond effectively. And so, yes, it started off this, I think, as being a question purely about regulation, but it's going to become very much more difficult to have a one-size-fits-all security approach if you're a multinational organization. And of course, for some, that's very bad news, because it means you're going to have to divert hard-working resource into looking at things that you probably would rather they didn't. But I think it is an opportunity to work more collaboratively with legal, for instance, and with some of the people who really understand the way in which regulation is moving. And of course, for very large organizations, a great opportunity to get involved and establish some of that private-public partnership with government to influence as well the way in which the regulatory landscape might change. Okay, let's move on. Oh, an interesting one here that's picking up on the cybersecurity exercises, the exercises around resilience that I mentioned. And the question is, how often should we run cybersecurity exercises, and who would you suggest participate? That's a really interesting one, because I think there's no one size fits all. If I'm thinking about running a cybersecurity exercise, I'm probably going to have to step back and say, well, why? What am I trying to achieve? Yes, it's about improving your satisfaction, your insight, your knowledge that the organization is able to be resilient, to respond effectively. But it's probably worth just sort of narrowing it down into a critical area to start with. If you haven't run any exercises yet, and there may well be some organizations listening to this who haven't, then it's worth starting with your most critical data areas. So almost put yourself in the mind of the attacker, if you like, and consider what would you do if you wanted to take a company down? What would you do that would cause the most inconvenience? That will really zero in on some of the areas where you might want to run a particular exercise. So having decided where you want to run it, then I think the question of who participates becomes a little easier, because clearly you want your security people involved, but you also want business leadership in that side of the house to really experience exactly what they're going to have to go through come the day that an attack or a breach takes place. So I think start with the data, first of all, to determine where you ought to be running an exercise. That will lead you into the people that you need to have doing it. In terms of how often, that's really a decision for your own organization based on your risk profile and risk appetite. But you should be running these things on a pretty regular basis. And if you're only doing one a year, then that's probably, in my view, the bare minimum. What else have we got? Okay, so one that has just come in that I think builds on one of the answers I was giving about private and public. And the question is, how important would you consider the collaboration between the private and public sector to be in reducing cyber threats? My answer to that is very important. And I say that for a couple of reasons. First, everybody, doesn't matter whether you're private or public sector, are suffering from skill shortage. We do have a threat landscape that is developing at a very fast pace. It's impossible for a lot of organizations to keep up with that. And so by pooling resources, that's a good way of ensuring that we've got some consistency around not only just how we approach some of those challenges, but we're also sharing and spreading the load a little bit. So, there may be skill sets that exist in the private sector that the public sector don't have access to, and vice versa. So I think more of those sorts of instances and opportunities to collaborate are really important in terms of dealing with that particular issue. And there are some very good examples of how this works around the world. So if you look at NIST, for instance, I think NIST is a good example of really working with private sector to come up with some public insights. NCSC is a pretty good example across in the UK as well. So lots of different examples there of how people can do it effectively. Oh, this is an interesting one. This is my first time joining this seminar. Well, welcome. Hope you enjoyed it or are enjoying it. I'm wondering if the COVID pandemic was really covered in last year's emerging risks, and if not, why? Gosh, that is a good question, isn't it? Was it covered, and if not, why? I think when I talk about threats, I view the pandemic as really a context within which we have to operate. I think that, the threat isn't so much for me the pandemic, it's what it causes us to do as a result of it. So for me, the threat might be an insider threat because people are working from home, or we're expanding and opening up gaps in our corporate networks because we're having to work from home, or because we're having to work with third parties that we haven't been able to vet in the way that we used to be able to vet them when we could actually go out and physically visit and that kind of thing. So those are the sorts of things that we would tend to pick up. My hope is that certainly how security has adapted to the pandemic, how we've introduced measures that really try to safeguard our organizations when we are working remotely, when we are necessarily having to share data that perhaps we're a little bit uncomfortable sharing because we're not overly sure about the environment it's moving into. But some of those things that we put in place will stand us in good stead for a post-pandemic environment that hopefully we'll move into sooner than later. A question here from an ISF member, bit of a cheeky one, I think. Which additional information will the new Threat Horizon Report 2024 bring in January 2022? Well, I can't really say is the answer to that, because our Threat Horizon Report, as you know, is one that we keep very closely guarded. It is something of a crown jewel. We will be releasing it to members in January. There will be a whole range of webinars and things that we'll be rolling out at that time, podcasts as well. So it is, I think, a very strong report this year in particular. There are some very interesting aspects that we've covered in it. And I should probably say no more than that, otherwise I'll get myself into trouble. But do look out for it in January. It is on target for release then. And of course, there'll be lots of promotion around it, as there always is. If you're not an ISF member listening to this and wondering what on earth we're talking about, this is a report that we produce every year that tries to forecast 2 years out some of the threats that we believe organizations ought to be taking into account. And the ISF offers solutions to addressing some of those challenges so that you can get slightly ahead of the game. So we do publish a summary of it, but of course the best way to get all of the access to that is to become an ISF member. And then you get to see all of the insights that clearly I can't talk about just now. Okay, this is quite a long one, but I think it's quite interesting. You mentioned the move to remote working during lockdown. How do you feel that the quick shift and therefore the lack of security analysis and management of the risks and vulnerabilities through the speed of this movement alters how these could increase the types of remote attacks that could occur? There's a lot in there. One of the things I would say about the lockdown and the way in which people had to respond was that there wasn't time. Now, from a security standpoint, of course, there are a couple of things that security guys really do like. It's having time, it's being able to think things through, it's being able to plan for it, test it, and so on. That was all taken away during the lockdown. And so we had to implement things and we had to change them on the fly. That actually, I think, is not a bad way of us considering how we might implement security going forward. And the reason I say that is that increasingly we have to be very much more agile. I talked about this in the presentation. We do have to look at how we can respond very, very quickly to some of the threats that appear, some of the situations that appear. So I think that some of the tools and methods and approaches that we used, we can revisit, we can rework, we can improve. And I think those can then find their way into the way that we perform security as usual. And that's really what's behind some of the essence of the threats I was talking about, where, security having to adapt to the never normal, agility being key. So I think that really learning what we can do quickly, where we need more time, and segmenting things that way is not a bad way for us to approach some of the things that we're going to need to be doing from a security standpoint going forward as organizations continue to grow and as we continue to have to deal with threats that we probably wish we didn't have to consider. I know that time is running away with us, but there are a couple in here that I do just want to see if I can squeeze in because they're slightly different tack, and I think they are interesting. The first one is around insurance. I didn't talk too much about cyber insurance in the presentation, so this one's quite an interesting one. Comes from France. Insurers are struggling to respond to the growing number of ransomware attacks. Will that mean organizations have to find other ways to fund their preparations and responses? I think cyber insurance has been around now for a little while, but in terms of the overall maturity of that industry, it's exceptionally immature, it's exceptionally embryonic. And the more attacks we have, the more ransomware incidents we have, I think all of that just fuels some of the approaches that the insurance companies are necessarily needing to take around what can reasonably be covered, what can't be covered. So I think that for anybody who is either with a cyber insurance policy or considering taking out a cyber insurance policy, the message here is to really examine in quite some detail what is covered and what isn't. That then will give you insight as to whether or not you're going to get the potential return or comfort on investment that you're taking from cyber insurance, and where perhaps you might need to spend additional funds to make sure that you're able to compensate for the areas that aren't covered for cyber insurance. It all comes back to, again, this word resilience from an organizational standpoint, but also making sure that your company is in the best position to respond to a situation that you really would rather not have happen, but you know full well is going to happen. And that, of course, is some form of cyber attack at some point in time. And one just final one that I've got here, because again, it's an area that I didn't touch on, and that is around mergers and acquisitions. And so question is, our company will be going through a merger in the first quarter of 2022. What should I do to make sure I can influence decisions and that security is built into the M&A process? And it's an interesting question, and one I really wanted to finish on, because I think it gives me the opportunity to talk about how I see security evolving over the next 12 to 18 to 24 months. And that's very much as providing consultative input. The security professional needs to be considered as being the subject matter expert within the organization. So the question about an acquisition or a merger and the involvement in that process, I would suggest isn't one for the security person to mandate. It's one for the business to mandate. The role of security is to be very clear about the value that can be added through that process. The role that security can play in terms of either making sure that the merging of two businesses is as seamless as possible, that all of the risk angles have been covered, that there's nothing hiding there that's going to, adversely impact the value of the new company as you come out of the M&A process. And we saw some mistakes that were made, over the past years with organizations that hadn't done due diligence in those particular areas. And in my experience, security is very often not asked to the table during an M&A process. And so I think it is about just reminding business leaders of the role that security has to play, of the value of being involved as early as possible, and then letting them make the decision as to when to call the security people in. But it has to come down to the value that can be contributed, the role that we can play, rather than anything else. So that, I'm afraid, is all that I've got time for. And I'm really sorry about this because there are so many questions that are coming in that I would really love to address and answer for you. So you can see me flicking through my iPad here. But as I say, we're out of time. So what I would suggest is if you did ask a question that you really wanted me to answer and I wasn't able to get to it, then do send me an email, do get hold of me via LinkedIn or on Twitter or give me a call. I'll be very happy to have a conversation. There's some really interesting points that are coming through there. Thank you very much indeed for dialing in. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that you found it to be interesting, thought-provoking, and I do hope to see you on one of the very many other ISF broadcasts that we've got planned for 2022. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks for joining us for the Emerging Threats Q&A. For those listening to this podcast who might still have questions for Steve on this topic, you can find his contact information in the show notes. This is our last episode of 2021, but we'll be back again in the new year. We wish you all a happy, healthy holiday season. In the meantime, if there's a topic or a question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode, let us know at securityforum.org, which is also where you can find the ISF catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like today's. You can find us on LinkedIn by searching CEO Steve Durbin or Security Forum. You can follow our audio feed wherever you get your podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. And if you like the ISF podcast, we would really appreciate it if you'd write a short review. The ISF podcast is produced by Talkbox and Tavia Gilbert, with music by Alexander Filipiak. Associate producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Brian Barney. Thanks for listening.